Picture this. October 16th, 1941. Moscow is falling apart. A cold rain hammers down on Makovsky Square, and Nikolai Bulganin, who would one day lead the Soviet Union but right now is just another worried bureaucrat, stands watching ordinary people smash their way into a food store. These aren't desperate, starving masses. These are panicked Muscovites who know the German army is less than 60 miles away and closing fast. Everyone in the city understands what's happening because the signs are everywhere. Trains crammed with government officials, stacks of classified documents, and the nation's gold reserves are racing eastward toward Kuibyshev. Factory workers are taking apart their machinery piece by piece and shipping it to the Urals. The Lenin mausoleum stands empty because they've already evacuated his embalmed body to somewhere safer. And in the chaos of realizing all this, Moscow is literally tearing itself to pieces. Bulganin watches a woman in a heavy wool coat hurl a brick straight through a bakery window. The moment the glass shatters, people flood inside, grabbing whatever they can carry. A police officer stands just 30 feet away, watching the whole scene unfold, doing absolutely nothing. Why would he? The Germans are coming. Everyone's saying it. The official radio broadcasts have gone silent on orders from above, and in that terrifying silence, every rumor becomes fact. The Nazis will be here in days, maybe hours. It's every man for himself now. But there's one man who hasn't packed his bags and run. Joseph Stalin sits in his office inside the Kremlin, just 2 miles from where Bulganin is watching his city dissolve into madness. He's been there all morning, reading report after report that makes the picture clearer and bleaker with every passing hour. The Western Front is collapsing in real time. German panzer divisions are racing toward the capital from multiple directions at once. Soviet units are either surrendering in droves or simply vanishing from the battlefield. Ivan Konev, the commander of the Western Front, can't even tell Stalin with any certainty where his own forces are actually positioned. For the last 4 months, Stalin has been forced to watch every single assumption he'd made about this war, about his army, about his own judgment prove catastrophically and undeniably wrong. It all started on June 22nd when 3 million German soldiers came crashing across the Soviet border in the largest military invasion in human history. Stalin had convinced himself it wouldn't happen. He'd signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler 2 years earlier, thinking he'd bought time, thinking he'd prepared his nation for whatever might come, or at least thinking he had. In the late 1930s, he'd purged his military of anyone he considered a potential traitor, executing 3 out of 5 marshals, 13 out of 15 army commanders, and 57 out of 85 corps commanders. He thought he was eliminating the weak, the disloyal, the unreliable. What he actually did was eliminate most of his experienced military leadership, and the disastrous result became crystal clear in the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa. Soviet units surrendered in numbers that still seem impossible to comprehend. This wasn't because Soviet soldiers were cowards, far from it, but because their commanders were terrified junior officers who'd been promoted way beyond their actual competence, all of them operating under a system where showing any initiative got you punished and deviating from orders in any way meant execution. German forces surrounded and captured entire Soviet armies in single operations. At Kiev alone, over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner. At Minsk, 300,000. At Smolensk, another 300,000. By October, the Germans had killed or captured over 3 million Soviet soldiers. They'd pushed 500 miles deep into Soviet territory. And now, with Operation Typhoon, they were making their final coordinated push toward Moscow itself. Stalin had brought this entire crisis down on his own head, and somewhere deep inside, he knew it. Georgy Zhukov, the one Soviet general who'd actually shown real competence in combat, stood in Stalin's office on October 10th and told him the brutal truth without any decoration or softening. The Western Front was finished. Moscow would fall unless they took drastic action immediately. They needed every reserve unit, every soldier that could be scraped together from other fronts. Most of all, they needed time. Stalin appointed Zhukov commander of the Western Front right there, and then asked him the only question that actually mattered. "Are you absolutely sure we can hold Moscow?" Zhukov, a stocky man with a blunt, weathered face and absolutely no talent for political survival beyond brutal honesty, looked directly at the Soviet leader and said he wasn't sure, but they had to try anyway. Stalin made his decision that very night. The government would evacuate. The foreign embassies would leave. The factories would be moved east. But he would stay. He would remain in Moscow, visible and present, the living embodiment of Soviet power standing firm in its capital. He announced this decision to his inner circle on October 15th. Molotov, his foreign minister, thought it was suicide. Beria, his secret police chief, was already quietly planning for a government in exile. But Stalin was absolutely adamant about this. If he left Moscow, the city would fall not to German tanks rolling down the streets, but to panic and internal collapse. The city would tear itself apart before the 1st Panzer even arrived. And he was right. The very next morning, October 16th, Moscow descended into complete chaos. With the government evacuating but no clear communication reaching the population, ordinary people assumed the absolute worst. Shops were looted in broad daylight. Officials burned sensitive documents in the streets, filling the air with ash and the acrid smell of burning paper. Prices collapsed overnight as desperate people tried to sell everything they owned for whatever they could get. A grand piano sold for 100 rubles. A fur coat went for 50. People were preparing to flee, preparing to die, or simply preparing for the end of everything they'd ever known. Into this swirling chaos, Stalin inserted himself with iron determination. He called an emergency meeting of the State Defense Committee and announced he was staying in Moscow. More than that, he was imposing order with brutal force. Looters would be shot on sight without trial. The NKVD would restore control by whatever means necessary. Anyone caught spreading panic would be arrested immediately. And then he said something that made his subordinates think he'd completely lost his mind. On November 7th, Revolution Day, there would be a full military parade in Red Square, exactly as there was every single year, as if absolutely nothing unusual was happening at all. His subordinates genuinely thought Stalin had snapped. The Germans were 50 miles away. Their reconnaissance units had already reached the town of Khimki, close enough that German officers could actually see the golden spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. The weather had turned brutally cold. Snow fell in thick, heavy sheets. The mud that had slowed the German advance in October was now freezing into iron-hard ruts that shredded vehicle suspensions. But the Germans were still coming, still pushing forward, still absolutely believing that one final coordinated effort would crack the Soviet capital wide open. And Stalin wanted to hold a parade. But he understood something his subordinates didn't grasp yet. The battle for Moscow wouldn't be won by tanks and artillery alone. It would be won by sheer will and determination. The entire Soviet system was held together by the appearance of overwhelming strength, by the projection of inevitable victory, by the personal charisma of the leader who embodied the state itself. If Stalin fled Moscow, that entire system would collapse like a house of cards. If he stayed and showed confidence, even completely false confidence, the system might hold together just long enough for Zhukov's desperate defense to actually work. The parade would be that projection of confidence made physical and visible to everyone. November 7th, 1941, Red Square. Snow falls steadily as soldiers march past Lenin's mausoleum in perfect formation. Tanks roll across the ancient cobblestones. Artillery pieces are towed into position, and Stalin stands on the reviewing platform, visible to absolutely everyone, wearing his trademark mustache and simple military-style tunic, watching his army parade past him. The symbolism is overwhelming and impossible to miss. While German forces sit less than 30 miles away, while the sound of distant artillery can be heard on quiet nights, Stalin is conducting business exactly as usual. The Revolution Day parade will happen because the Soviet state is eternal, unshakable, and destined to triumph no matter what. But it's the speech that really matters. Stalin isn't a natural orator by any means. He speaks with a thick Georgian accent he never lost throughout his entire life. His voice is rough and gravelly, his delivery measured and deliberately slow. But he understands exactly how to use history, how to invoke the deep, powerful currents of Russian identity that run beneath the surface of Soviet ideology. He begins by addressing the soldiers directly, and many of them will march straight from Red Square to the front lines. They know it. He knows it. There's absolutely no point in pretending otherwise. Comrades, he says, his voice carrying across the square through crackling loudspeakers, we are celebrating the 24th anniversary of the October Revolution in difficult conditions. The perfidious attack by the German fascists and the war that has been forced upon us have created a serious threat to our country. He doesn't minimize the crisis one bit. He doesn't pretend everything is fine. He acknowledges the harsh reality that every single soldier in that square understands all too well. Then he pivots brilliantly. The enemy is cruel and implacable. He is out to seize our lands watered with our sweat, to seize our grain and oil secured by our labor. He is out to restore the rule of landlords, to restore Tsarism, to destroy the national culture and the national state existence of the Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Uzbeks, Tatars, Moldavians, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and all the other free peoples of the Soviet Union. He's deliberately framing this war not as a defense of communist ideology, but as a defense of Russian civilization itself, of everything that makes these nations what they are. And then he reaches far, back into history, invoking the legendary heroes of Russia's past. Let the manly images of our great ancestors inspire you in this war, he declares. Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Donskoy, Kuzma Minin, Dmitry Pozharsky, Alexander Suvorov, Mikhail Kutuzov. These aren't communist heroes from recent decades. These are Russian heroes from centuries past. Medieval princes who fought off foreign invaders. Brilliant generals who defeated Napoleon's Grand Army. Stalin is wrapping the Soviet cause in the oldest, deepest identity available, the one that transcends ideology completely. And then he delivers the line that will be remembered and quoted for decades to come. Let the victorious banner of the great Lenin inspire you in this war. Death to the German invaders. The soldiers roar their approval. They march from Red Square directly to the front lines. Many of them will die within days. But they march forward believing that Stalin believes in victory, that the system will hold, that Moscow will stand no matter what. Behind the closed doors of the Kremlin, Stalin is far less certain about any of this. In private meetings with Zhukov and his other top commanders, He's brutally blunt about their actual situation. They're outnumbered in almost every sector. The Germans have better equipment, better training, better tactical coordination. Soviet forces are still reeling from the catastrophic disasters of the summer. Entire armies have been destroyed. The industrial capacity of the Western Soviet Union has been lost or evacuated eastward. They're fighting with whatever they have left, and it's not nearly enough. But they do have two crucial advantages working in their favor. First, the weather. The bitter cold that's making life miserable for everyone is making it absolutely catastrophic for the Germans. Their vehicles weren't winterized because nobody expected the campaign to last this long. Their soldiers don't have proper winter clothing. The Wehrmacht had confidently expected to win before winter arrived, and now they're paying a terrible price for that assumption. German tanks won't start in the morning cold. German soldiers are getting severe frostbite. Supply lines are stretching dangerously close to the breaking point. Second, reinforcements from an unexpected source. Stalin had been receiving crucial intelligence from Richard Sorge, a brilliant Soviet spy operating in Tokyo, confirming that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union from the east. That single piece of intelligence meant Stalin could safely pull entire divisions from Siberia and the Far East. These were fresh troops who were specifically trained for winter warfare, properly equipped for extreme cold weather, and ready to fight immediately. Zhukov was quietly massing these forces for a massive counteroffensive. But first, Moscow had to survive the final desperate German push. Throughout November, the battle raged in the frozen forests and snow-covered fields around Moscow. German forces pushed closer and closer. Soviet forces held their ground, broke under pressure, reformed their lines, and held again. It was grinding, brutal combat in conditions that made fighting almost unbearable for both sides. Temperatures dropped to 20 below 0 Fahrenheit, then 30 below, then 40 below. Soldiers on both sides were dying from exposure to the elements just as much as from enemy fire. The Germans finally reached Khimki, a northern suburb of Moscow, on November 28th. They were close enough that their officers could clearly see the golden domes of the Kremlin with their own eyes. Some historical accounts claim German reconnaissance units actually got within 12 miles of the city center. They were utterly exhausted, freezing, desperately undersupplied, but they were right there at the gates. One more coordinated push might actually do it. Stalin received the reports sitting at his desk in the Kremlin. The Germans were literally at the gates of the capital. The city's outer defensive lines were holding, but just barely. If the Germans managed to break through those defenses, there was virtually nothing between them and the Kremlin except a few hastily assembled reserve units and the NKVD internal troops. He called Zhukov directly and asked if the counteroffensive was ready to launch. Not yet, Zhukov said honestly. Another week, maybe less. The Siberian divisions were still moving into their attack positions. They desperately needed more time. Stalin told him flatly that he didn't have another week to give him. He had days at most, maybe hours. Zhukov said he'd make it work somehow. On December 5th, with German forces literally within sight of Moscow's buildings, the massive Soviet counteroffensive began. Fresh Siberian divisions, fully equipped with proper winter clothing and winter-capable equipment, hit the exhausted, freezing German forces from multiple directions simultaneously. The Germans, who'd been repeatedly told by their own intelligence that the Soviets had absolutely no reserves left, that one more push would finish them completely, suddenly found themselves facing 100,000 fresh, well-equipped troops appearing seemingly out of nowhere. The German line buckled under the pressure almost immediately. Within days, it broke completely. The Wehrmacht began retreating from Moscow, not in any kind of orderly tactical withdrawal, but in something that looked disturbingly close to a chaotic rout. Entire units abandoned heavy equipment that simply wouldn't start in the brutal cold. Soldiers threw away their weapons just to move faster through the deep snow. The retreat continued relentlessly through December and into January, pushing the Germans back 60 to 150 miles from Moscow. The capital was saved. Stalin's enormous gamble had actually worked. By staying in Moscow when any rational calculation said to leave, by projecting absolute confidence even when the situation was desperate beyond words, he'd held the entire Soviet system together just long enough for Zhukov to organize an effective defense and launch a devastating counterattack. The speech at the parade, the deliberate invocation of Russian historical heroes, the visible presence of the leader standing firm in the capital, all of it had contributed to preventing the internal collapse that might have handed Moscow to the Germans without a final climactic battle. But the cost was absolutely staggering beyond comprehension. The Battle of Moscow, fought from October through January, cost the Soviet Union somewhere between 600,000 and well over 1 million casualties, depending on exactly how you count them and which records you trust. The Germans lost between 250,000 and 400,000 men. Entire Soviet divisions were completely destroyed. Villages around Moscow were reduced to nothing but ash and frozen corpses. The forests where the heaviest fighting happened were left looking like alien lunar landscapes, trees shattered into splinters by artillery fire, ground churned into frozen mud and blood. And Stalin knew with absolute certainty that this was just the beginning of a much longer war. The Germans had been stopped at Moscow, but they definitely hadn't been defeated or destroyed. They still occupied vast stretches of Soviet territory. They still had millions of soldiers under arms. They would regroup over the winter, resupply their battered units, and attack again in the spring. This war would drag on for years. The casualties would climb into the tens of millions before it was over. But Moscow had held firm. And in holding Moscow against everything the Wehrmacht could throw at it, Stalin had preserved the Soviet Union's ability to continue fighting, to keep resisting, to eventually push back. In the years after the war finally ended, Soviet propaganda would build the Battle of Moscow into an almost mythical legendary victory, with Stalin portrayed as the military genius who'd personally orchestrated the entire brilliant defense. The actual reality was far more complicated and messy. Stalin's brutal purges of the officer corps had severely weakened the Red Army and directly contributed to the catastrophic disasters of 1941. His stubborn refusal to believe intelligence reports about the coming German invasion had left the Soviet Union dangerously unprepared. His constant interference in military operations had often made bad situations dramatically worse. But at Moscow, in that single moment of supreme crisis when everything hung in the balance, he'd made exactly the right call. He'd stayed when he could have fled. He'd projected unshakable confidence when everything was falling apart. He'd held the system together through sheer force of will, and he'd given Zhukov the precious time and critical resources to organize a defense that actually worked against all odds. The speech he delivered on November 7th wasn't militarily significant in any tactical sense. It didn't change the actual disposition of forces or alter the strategic situation on the ground. But it fundamentally changed the psychological situation for millions of people. It told the Soviet people and the Soviet military that their leader absolutely believed in victory, that the state remained intact and functional, that the struggle would continue no matter what. In a system built entirely on the cult of personality, on the constant projection of inevitable triumph, on the personal charisma of the supreme leader that mattered enormously. Stalin understood power in ways most people never grasp. He understood that real power wasn't just about controlling tanks and divisions and artillery. It was about controlling belief, about carefully managing the perception of strength, about maintaining the willingness of millions of people to keep fighting even when the situation seemed completely hopeless. At Moscow, when the Germans reached the very gates, when the entire city was on the verge of mass panic, when his own subordinates thought the cause was utterly lost, Stalin said exactly what he always said, what defined his entire brutal approach to power. "We will hold our ground. We will fight to the end. We will win this war." And because he said it with absolute conviction, because he stayed when he easily could have fled to safety, because he projected complete certainty when literally everything was uncertain, enough people believed him to make it come true. The Battle of Moscow was the first major German defeat of the entire Second World War. It completely shattered the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility that had terrified Europe for years. It proved beyond any doubt that the Soviet Union could be pushed right to the absolute brink of total collapse and still find a way to fight back. It established the brutal template for the rest of the Eastern Front. Grinding attritional warfare where the Soviets would deliberately trade space and lives for precious time, absorbing massive German offensives and then counterattacking viciously when the enemy was finally exhausted. Stalin would make many more serious mistakes in the years ahead. He would order disastrous offensives that accomplished nothing. He would stubbornly refuse to allow necessary retreats when retreat was clearly the only sensible option. He would continue to rule through terror and fear, executing generals who failed and sometimes even executing generals who succeeded too well. The final Soviet victory in World War II would come at an almost incomprehensible cost of over 27 million Soviet dead, a casualty rate that absolutely dwarfed every other nation that participated in the war. But at Moscow in November and December of 1941, Stalin did exactly what needed to be done in that moment. He stayed in the capital when every rational calculation said to leave. He projected absolute confidence when the military situation was desperate. He gave a powerful speech invoking legendary Russian heroes and deep Russian identity, deliberately wrapping the Soviet cause in something far older and deeper than communist ideology. And he asked Zhukov directly if Moscow could be held, accepted the brutally honest answer that it might not be possible, and gave the order to try anyway. The Germans reached the gates of Moscow. They could see the Kremlin's golden spires with their own eyes. They genuinely thought they were on the verge of final victory. And Stalin, standing on that reviewing platform in Red Square while snow fell steadily and soldiers marched past in formation, told them and everyone watching that they were completely wrong. Moscow would hold. The Soviet Union would fight. The war would continue. And he was right.